Something strange is happening inside the WNBA right now, and the league office is desperately trying to keep it quiet. Behind the sold-out arenas, record TV ratings, and viral highlights, rumors have been spreading that a group of veteran players were so frustrated with the direction of the league that they began discussing drastic options, including refusing to participate in certain situations if things didn't change. If that sounds unbelievable, it's because just months ago the WNBA was celebrating what many called the most important moment in its history. A new wave of fans was flooding into arenas. Ticket prices were skyrocketing. Television numbers were exploding past anything the league had ever seen before. And at the center of it all was one name: Caitlin Clark. The rookie guard who shattered scoring records in college didn't just enter the WNBA. She detonated into it like a cultural event. Every arena she visited suddenly became the hottest ticket in town. Jerseys disappeared from shelves overnight. Games that normally drew modest viewership suddenly started competing with major sports broadcasts. From the outside, it looked like the league had finally found its golden moment. But inside the locker rooms, the story wasn't nearly that simple. Because while fans were celebrating the arrival of a superstar, whispers began circulating that many players felt something very different was happening behind the scenes. To them, this wasn't just about one talented rookie becoming popular. It felt like the entire identity of the league was being rewritten overnight. And some veterans weren't sure they liked the new script. Private conversations started spreading through team group chats. Frustrations that had been quietly building for years suddenly came pouring out. Players who had spent a decade grinding through the league's toughest seasons were watching the spotlight shift faster than anyone expected. To the public, the WNBA had never looked healthier. But internally, insiders say tensions were rising fast. Some players felt the league was bending over backwards to protect its newest star. Others believed the media had created a storyline where anyone who challenged her immediately became the villain. And then there were the financial realities. Because while Caitlin Clark was bringing millions of dollars of attention into the league, the players who built the WNBA were still fighting for things they had been requesting for years. Better travel, better pay, better treatment. Suddenly, those long-standing demands were being compared to the explosive popularity of a single rookie. And that's when the conversations started getting serious. Not just complaints, not just locker room venting. Real discussions about power, about leverage, about how far players might be willing to go if they believed the league was leaving them behind during the most profitable moment in its history. Some insiders claim those conversations eventually reached a shocking place. Talk of drastic collective action if the league continued moving in a direction they felt ignored the veterans who built the sport. Now, whether those discussions were serious or simply emotional reactions in heated moments is still debated. But the fact that they were even being whispered about reveals just how tense things have become behind the scenes. Because what fans see on the court is only part of the story. The real battle might be happening off of it. A battle over money, over respect, over the future identity of women's basketball. And to understand how the WNBA reached this boiling point, you have to go back to the exact moment everything changed. The moment Caitlin Clark officially declared for the draft. Because that announcement didn't just bring excitement. For some people inside the league, it brought a storm they knew was coming. And once it arrived, there was no stopping it. When Caitlin Clark announced she was entering the WNBA draft, everyone knew it would be big. But no one truly understood just how massive the impact would be. For years, the league had been growing steadily but quietly. Dedicated fans followed it closely, players were building incredible careers, and the level of basketball kept improving season after season. Yet despite the talent on the court, the WNBA often struggled to break into mainstream sports conversations. Then Caitlin Clark happened. Her college career at Iowa had already turned her into one of the most recognizable athletes in the country. She wasn't just scoring points, she was rewriting record books. Deep three-pointers from distances normally reserved for the NBA became routine. Arena crowds doubled, and sometimes tripled wherever she played. And the numbers were impossible to ignore. Millions of viewers tuned in to watch Iowa games. Sports networks suddenly began leading their broadcasts with women's college basketball highlights. Social media clips of Clark launching logo threes started spreading across the internet like wildfire. By the time she declared for the WNBA draft, the hype had reached a level rarely seen in the history of women's sports. Everyone expected attention. But what followed shocked even the most optimistic league executives. The moment Clark was drafted by the Indiana Fever, ticket sales exploded across the entire league. Not just in Indiana. Everywhere. Teams that normally played in mid-size arenas suddenly had to move games to larger venues when Clark came to town. Tickets that used to sell for modest prices were suddenly appearing online for hundreds of dollars. In some cities, secondary market prices climbed even higher. And it wasn't just the arenas. Television ratings began smashing previous records. Games featuring Clark started drawing audiences that rivaled major NBA matchups on certain nights. Broadcasters who previously gave limited coverage to the WNBA suddenly wanted more games, more interviews, and more content centered around the new superstar. Sponsors noticed too. Brands that had previously stayed on the sidelines began rushing into the league, hoping to attach themselves to the surge of attention surrounding Clark. It was the type of momentum the WNBA had been chasing for decades. And in many ways, Caitlin Clark delivered exactly what the league had been hoping for. Visibility. Relevance. A massive new audience. But inside the locker rooms, the reaction wasn't as simple as celebration. Because while Clark's arrival was bringing unprecedented attention, many veteran players couldn't ignore the sudden shift in how the league was being presented to the world. For years, players like Diana Taurasi, Aya Wilson, Breanna Stewart, and countless others had carried the league through its toughest moments. They built its credibility. They fought for respect. They kept playing even when arenas weren't full and media coverage was limited. They were the foundation. Now, suddenly, the spotlight seemed to be pointing somewhere else. Every sports show wanted to talk about Caitlin Clark. Every headline focused on Caitlin Clark. Every promotional video seemed to revolve around Caitlin Clark. For some players, that shift felt natural. After all, superstars often bring attention that lifts an entire league. But for others, the speed of the transformation raised uncomfortable questions. Was the league celebrating a new star? Or was it quietly replacing the faces that had built the sport for nearly 3 decades? Some veterans began noticing subtle changes. Media requests started concentrating heavily around Clark games. Marketing campaigns featured her prominently. Broadcasts often framed matchups as the rookie versus whoever happened to be standing on the other side of the court. Even incredible performances by other players sometimes struggled to break through the noise. Meanwhile, Clark herself was just trying to play basketball. She stepped into the league carrying expectations that would overwhelm most athletes. Every game became a national conversation. Every turnover, every deep three, every hard foul instantly went viral. And the pressure only grew as the season continued. Opposing teams began treating every game against Indiana like a playoff battle. Arenas were louder. Fans were more intense. Media attention became relentless. For Clark, it was the reality of being the most talked-about rookie in the history of the league. But for some veterans, it felt like the balance of the entire WNBA ecosystem had shifted overnight. The league that once celebrated dozens of stars suddenly seemed to orbit around one. And that perception, whether accurate or not, planted the first seeds of tension. Because attention brings money, and money brings power. And soon, the financial side of Caitlin Clark's arrival would ignite an even bigger conversation inside the league. A conversation that had been quietly brewing for years. But now, with millions of new dollars suddenly entering the sport, players started asking a question that would change everything. Who is really benefiting from the Caitlin Clark boom? And the answer to that question would open the door to one of the most controversial debates the WNBA had ever faced. But that financial earthquake was only just beginning. The attention surrounding Caitlin Clark was already unprecedented. But what truly sent shockwaves through the basketball world wasn't a game, or a highlight, or even a sold-out arena. It was a contract. Before Clark had even played a single professional minute, reports surfaced that she had secured a massive endorsement deal with Nike worth around $28 million. For most professional athletes, that kind of deal comes after years of proving themselves at the highest level. Championships, MVP seasons, global recognition. Clark hadn't even completed her rookie training camp. And yet suddenly, she was signing one of the largest endorsement deals ever connected to women's basketball. From a business perspective, the move made perfect sense. Brands weren't just investing in Clark the player. They were investing in Clark the phenomenon. Her college games had generated historic ratings. Her highlights dominated social media. Millions of new fans were entering women's basketball through her. Nike clearly believed she represented the future of the sport. But inside the WNBA, the news landed very differently. Because many of the league's biggest stars had spent their entire careers fighting for the very opportunities Clark was now receiving almost instantly. Players like Aya Wilson had already built championship legacies. Breanna Stewart had dominated both the WNBA and international play. Diana Taurasi had spent nearly 2 decades establishing herself as one of the greatest players ever. Yet none of those players walked into the league with a deal remotely close to that size. So when the reports about Clark's contract began circulating, it sparked an uncomfortable conversation that quickly spread through locker rooms. Not because players believed Clark didn't deserve success, but because the contrast was impossible to ignore. For years, WNBA players had been forced to spend their off-seasons overseas just to supplement their income. Many of the league's best stars played in Turkey, Russia, or China during the winter months because the salaries in the WNBA alone simply weren't enough. It was a reality that had been normalized for decades. Elite athletes traveling thousands of miles away from home every year just to secure financial stability. And suddenly, a rookie was walking into the league with a multi-million-dollar endorsement empire waiting for her. To some players, the optics felt like a slap in the face. Not necessarily because of Clark herself, but because of what it seemed to represent. It felt like proof that the money had always been there. It just hadn't been offered to them. Some veterans began asking a difficult question. If corporations were suddenly willing to pour millions into women's basketball because of one player, why hadn't they done it sooner for the players who built the league? The debate wasn't happening publicly at first. Most players understood how dangerous it could look to criticize the arrival of the most popular athlete the league had ever seen. But behind the scenes, the conversations were getting louder. Because Clark's deal didn't just represent success. It represented a massive shift in the business of women's basketball. Sponsors were entering the space more aggressively than ever before. Merchandise sales were skyrocketing. Television contracts were suddenly becoming more valuable. The financial ceiling of the league was expanding rapidly. And that created another question. If the WNBA was entering its most profitable era ever, who would control that money? Would it go to the league? To sponsors? To new marketing campaigns? Or would the players who had spent years building the foundation finally receive the compensation they had been demanding for decades? Those questions were already simmering when another controversial issue suddenly exploded into the spotlight. And this time, it wasn't about endorsements. It was about something far more basic. Something players had been requesting for years. Safer travel. Because for more than 2 decades, WNBA players had been flying commercial flights across the country, often squeezed into economy seats while trying to recover from intense games and prepare for the next matchup. It was one of the league's most common complaints. Players argued that their bodies were being pushed to the limit with grueling travel schedules that professional athletes in other major leagues rarely had to deal with. For years, they asked for charter flights. And for years, the answer had always been the same. The league couldn't afford it. But suddenly, after Caitlin Clark arrived, the conversation changed. And that decision would ignite one of the most controversial debates in the entire league. Because to many players, it looked like the WNBA had just found the money it claimed didn't exist. And that revelation was about to pour gasoline on an already growing fire. But the situation was about to get even more explosive. Because the next incident wouldn't happen in a boardroom. It would happen on the court. And millions of people would watch it unfold in real time. For years, WNBA players had been asking for one simple change. Not a new rule. Not a bigger trophy. Not even a salary increase. They wanted better travel. It sounds like a small detail, but for professional athletes, travel can make or break a season. Long flights, cramped seats, airport delays, and tight turnarounds between games can destroy recovery time and increase injury risk. And for WNBA players, those problems had been part of the job since the league was founded. While athletes in leagues like the NBA traveled on private charter flights designed for comfort and recovery, WNBA players often flew commercial. That meant navigating crowded airports, squeezing into economy seats, and sometimes dealing with fans or media during travel days when they were supposed to be resting. It wasn't just inconvenient. Many players believed it was dangerous for their health. For over a decade, players had repeatedly asked the league to invest in charter travel. They argued it would improve safety, allow better recovery, and show that the league truly valued its athletes. But every time the issue came up, the answer was the same. The league simply didn't have the budget. Officials explained that charter flights were extremely expensive and that the WNBA's financial structure couldn't support it yet. Players were told that maybe someday, when revenue grew, the conversation could happen again. So the athletes kept playing, season after season, game after game. Many of them accepted the situation as part of the struggle of building a league that was still fighting for recognition. Then something changed. When Caitlin Clark entered the WNBA, her popularity created a new problem the league had never faced before: security. The arenas were filling up faster than ever. Fans were traveling across the country just to see her play. Social media conversations around Clark were exploding with both praise and criticism. Suddenly, league officials began worrying about safety during travel. Large crowds could gather at airports. Fans might try to approach players during boarding. The attention around certain games was reaching levels the WNBA had rarely experienced. And almost overnight, the conversation about charter flights came back. This time, the answer was different. The league announced that teams would begin transitioning toward charter flights for travel, citing player safety and logistical challenges created by the surge in popularity. From the outside, it looked like a huge victory. Players had been asking for this change for years, and now it was finally happening. But inside some locker rooms, the reaction was complicated, because the timing felt impossible to ignore. For years, players had been told the money didn't exist. Now, suddenly, the budget had appeared. To many veterans, the message felt clear. The league had been unwilling to spend the money when it was about the players who had built the sport. But once a new superstar arrived bringing massive attention and revenue, the financial barriers disappeared. Again, the frustration wasn't necessarily directed at Caitlin Clark herself. Most players understood that she wasn't the one making business decisions. But the situation highlighted a deeper issue that had been simmering for years: respect. Players who had spent their entire careers pushing the league forward couldn't help but feel like their voices had gone unheard until the arrival of a rookie forced the issue. Some insiders described the mood as bittersweet. Yes, charter flights were a huge improvement, but the path that led to them left a bad taste for some veterans. It reinforced a belief that the league's priorities had shifted dramatically. And as more money began flowing into women's basketball, players started paying closer attention to how those resources were being distributed. Because if the league could suddenly afford charter flights, what else could it afford? That question would soon collide with something even more explosive. A moment on the court that would ignite national headlines, trigger fan wars across social media, and push tensions between players and the new wave of Caitlin Clark supporters to an entirely new level. It happened during a regular season game. But the impact of that single play would ripple through the entire league. Because what looked like a simple foul quickly turned into one of the most controversial moments of the season. And once the internet got involved, the situation spiraled into chaos. Up until that moment, most of the tension surrounding Caitlin Clark existed mostly in whispers. Locker room conversations, group chats, private frustrations. But then something happened on the court that brought all of that tension out into the open. And suddenly, the entire sports world was watching. It happened during a regular season matchup that already had plenty of attention surrounding it. Whenever Clark stepped onto the court, the atmosphere felt different. Arenas were louder. Cameras were everywhere. Every possession seemed to carry a little more weight. Opposing players knew millions of people were watching. And that pressure created a different kind of energy. The game itself was already physical. Defenses were aggressive, bodies were colliding, and players were clearly playing with extra intensity. That wasn't unusual in professional basketball. Rookies often faced tough treatment from veterans as a way of testing them. But this play went further. During one possession, Clark was moving without the ball when Chicago Sky guard Kennedy Carter delivered a hard hip check that knocked her to the floor. For a split second, the arena froze. Then the reaction started. Clark hit the hardwood. Players looked around. Fans erupted. Within minutes, the clip began spreading across the internet. And once social media got hold of it, the moment exploded. Sports shows replayed the video over and over again. Commentators debated whether the play crossed the line. Some argued it was simply tough defense. Others believed it was clearly intentional. But the conversation quickly moved beyond the foul itself. The internet turned it into a symbol. To many of Clark's supporters, the play represented something they believed had been happening all season: veteran players targeting the rookie because of her popularity. They pointed to other moments where Clark had been knocked down or defended aggressively. They argued that some players were trying to send a message. Meanwhile, many players across the league saw the situation very differently. From their perspective, the media reaction was wildly exaggerated. Basketball is a physical sport. Hard fouls happen in every league, every season. Players challenge rookies constantly. It's part of how professional sports work. Yet this particular play was suddenly being treated like a national scandal. And that's where things became even more complicated. Because as the debate exploded online, the backlash against Kennedy Carter began to spiral out of control. Her social media accounts were flooded with angry messages. Comment sections filled with insults. Some fans accused her of deliberately trying to injure Clark. Others went even further, using language that many players across the league found deeply offensive. Within hours, the situation had transformed into something much bigger than a basketball play. It became a cultural flashpoint. Players across the WNBA began quietly rallying around Carter. Some believed she was being unfairly vilified for a moment that, in their eyes, wasn't unusual in professional competition. They saw the flood of online attacks and felt the league wasn't doing enough to protect its athletes from the backlash. To them, the real issue wasn't the foul. It was the reaction. Because in their eyes, every time a player defended Clark aggressively, the same pattern seemed to repeat itself. The moment would go viral. Fans would explode online. And suddenly the opposing player would be painted as the villain. That dynamic created a new kind of pressure inside games. Some players reportedly felt like they were walking on eggshells whenever they faced Clark. If they played too physically, they risked becoming the next viral controversy. If they backed off, they were accused of letting her dominate. Either way, they felt trapped in a narrative they couldn't control. Meanwhile, the media machine surrounding Clark continued growing larger by the day. Every highlight generated millions of views. Every debate generated new headlines. And the more attention the situation received, the more the league began to feel like two completely different worlds. On one side were the millions of new fans discovering women's basketball through Caitlin Clark. On the other side were the players who had spent years fighting for respect in a league that had rarely received this level of attention before. The collision between those two worlds was becoming increasingly tense. And just when things seemed like they couldn't get more heated, the media jumped directly into the fire. Because several major sports personalities decided to weigh in on the controversy. And what they said only poured gasoline on an already raging debate. The conversation was no longer just about basketball. Now it was about narratives, about respect, about who was really responsible for the chaos surrounding the most talked-about rookie in the sport. And the next chapter of this story would push the conflict even further into the spotlight. If the foul on Caitlin Clark lit the match, the media poured gasoline on the fire. Because once the clip went viral, it wasn't just fans arguing anymore. Now the biggest voices in sports media were jumping into the debate. Every major sports show suddenly had an opinion about what was happening inside the WNBA. Analysts replayed the footage frame by frame. Commentators started asking whether Clark was being unfairly targeted. And before long, the conversation stopped being about a single play. It became a full-blown narrative battle. Some media personalities began defending Clark aggressively. They argued that the league should protect its most valuable star and warned that excessive physical play could hurt the WNBA's new surge in popularity. To them, Clark represented the future of the sport, the player bringing millions of new eyes to women's basketball. But other voices saw the situation completely differently. They believed the media was unfairly painting veteran players as jealous or bitter simply because they were competing against a rookie. That divide quickly spilled across television screens and social media feeds. One controversial moment came when a major sports personality referred to Clark using language that immediately sparked backlash across the basketball community. Even though the comment was meant as praise, many players and fans felt the wording created a damaging narrative. Suddenly the debate wasn't just about Clark's popularity. It was about how the entire league was being portrayed. Many players felt that the coverage was reducing years of hard work into a simple storyline. a young superstar surrounded by jealous veterans who couldn't handle her success. From their perspective, that narrative ignored everything the league had built long before Clark arrived. Players like Aya Wilson were dominating the sport. Breanna Stewart was winning championships. Sabrina Ionescu was becoming one of the most skilled guards in the league. Yet every conversation seemed to circle back to one name: Caitlin Clark. For some athletes, that imbalance became increasingly frustrating, because no matter what happened during a game, the spotlight always seemed to return to the rookie. If Clark had a great performance, the story was about her brilliance. If an opposing player defended her aggressively, the story became about targeting. And if another player outplayed her entirely, the coverage often framed it as part of Clark's learning process rather than celebrating the veteran who dominated the matchup. Many players began feeling like they were stuck inside a narrative they had no control over. And that frustration was only growing as fan behavior on social media became more intense. Because with millions of new viewers entering the WNBA for the first time, the online environment surrounding the league changed dramatically. Debates turned into arguments. Arguments turned into harassment. Players who simply competed against Clark suddenly found themselves facing waves of criticism online. Some reported receiving thousands of hostile messages after games. Others said their social media mentions became flooded anytime they defended Clark aggressively. To them, it felt like the league had invited a new fan culture into women's basketball, but wasn't fully prepared for the consequences. And that created another uncomfortable question. Was the WNBA willing to defend its players if the backlash became too intense? Or would the league continue focusing on the massive attention Clark was bringing? These tensions began simmering across the entire season. Every press conference felt a little more tense. Every post-game interview carried a little more weight. Players carefully chose their words, knowing that any comment could instantly become the next viral headline. But just when the situation seemed like it might settle down, another decision shocked the sports world. A decision involving the most prestigious team in international basketball, Team USA. When the Olympic roster was announced, millions of fans were expecting to see Caitlin Clark's name on the list. Instead, her name wasn't there, and the reaction was immediate. Because the moment that roster dropped, the entire conversation around Clark and the WNBA exploded again. But what fans didn't realize was that behind the scenes, that decision may have revealed something much bigger. Something that showed just how much influence veteran players still held inside the league. And the rumors surrounding that decision would push the tension to an entirely new level. When Team USA released the official roster for the Paris Olympics, fans across the country were expecting one name to appear without question: Caitlin Clark. At that point, Clark had become the most talked-about player in women's basketball. Her games were breaking viewership records, arenas were selling out weeks in advance, and millions of new fans were following the WNBA for the first time because of her. From a marketing standpoint, it seemed obvious. Putting Clark on the Olympic roster would instantly boost global attention for women's basketball. Television numbers would likely skyrocket. Sponsors would flood into the broadcast. The Olympics would become another massive stage for the sport's newest superstar. But when the roster was finally revealed, Clark's name wasn't on it. The reaction was immediate. Fans were stunned. Social media exploded. Sports shows began debating the decision within minutes. Some people were furious. To them, leaving the most popular player in the sport off the Olympic team made absolutely no sense. They argued that the Olympics were the perfect opportunity to showcase women's basketball to a worldwide audience that was already fascinated by Clark's rise. Why leave that opportunity on the table? But others defended the decision. Team USA had built its reputation on experience, chemistry, and veteran leadership. The Olympic roster has always been incredibly competitive, and historically it has been extremely difficult for rookies to make the team. From a basketball perspective, many analysts said the decision wasn't surprising at all. The roster was filled with championship players who had proven themselves internationally for years. Still, the timing of the decision made it impossible to ignore the larger context. Because at the exact moment Caitlin Clark was dominating headlines across the sports world, the Olympic Committee chose to move forward without her. And that choice sparked another wave of speculation. Some insiders quietly suggested that the decision may have been influenced by concerns about the intense media attention surrounding Clark. Olympic teams are built on chemistry, and some believed the non-stop spotlight could create distractions during the tournament. Others pushed back on that idea entirely. They insisted the decision was purely about basketball experience and nothing else. But regardless of the reasoning, the public reaction revealed just how divided the conversation around Clark had become. Fans who supported Clark saw the decision as another example of the league resisting her popularity. Meanwhile, many veteran players felt the outrage proved something else entirely, that the conversation around the WNBA had become completely dominated by one storyline. Even the Olympic roster, one of the most prestigious honors in basketball, had instantly turned into another Caitlin Clark debate. And that realization only added to the tension that had already been building throughout the season. Because behind the scenes, players were watching the entire situation unfold. Every headline, every argument, every viral debate. They saw how quickly the narrative surrounding the league could shift. One day the conversation was about competition. The next day it was about controversy. And many players began realizing something important. The explosion of attention surrounding Caitlin Clark wasn't just changing the WNBA's popularity. It was changing its power structure. Money was pouring into the league faster than ever before. Sponsorships were growing. Television deals were becoming more valuable. Arena attendance was surging. For the first time in decades, the WNBA was sitting on the edge of a massive financial boom. And that meant one thing: leverage. Players across the league understood that this moment represented a rare opportunity. If the league was suddenly generating more revenue than ever before, then the athletes themselves wanted to ensure they received a fair share of that growth. Because for years, they had been fighting for better salaries, better working conditions, and a larger piece of the league's revenue. Now that the spotlight had finally arrived, they didn't want to watch someone else walk away with the biggest rewards. That growing realization is what eventually led to the most shocking rumors circulating around the league. Rumors that some players were discussing drastic ways to make their voices heard. Not just complaints, not just negotiations, something much bigger. A potential power move that could shake the entire league. Because if the players truly believed their contributions were being overlooked during the WNBA's most profitable moment, some insiders say they were prepared to remind everyone exactly who makes the league possible in the first place. And those rumors would lead to the most dramatic chapter of this entire story. By the middle of the season, it was becoming impossible to ignore something unusual happening around the WNBA. The games were bigger than ever. Crowds were louder. Television ratings were climbing to levels the league had never experienced before. On paper, everything looked perfect. But behind the scenes, insiders say the atmosphere inside certain locker rooms felt very different. Because while the league was celebrating its sudden explosion in popularity, many players were beginning to ask a simple but uncomfortable question. If the WNBA was finally making serious money, where was that money going? For years, players had accepted that the league was still growing. Salaries were modest compared to other professional leagues. Many athletes traveled overseas during the off-season to earn additional income. It was a grind, but players accepted it because they believed they were building something bigger for the future. Now that future seemed to be arriving. Attendance was surging. Merchandise sales were skyrocketing. Broadcast deals were becoming more valuable. Corporate sponsors were suddenly investing millions into women's basketball. And yet, many players still felt like their financial reality hadn't changed much. That growing frustration began fueling deeper conversations among players about leverage. Because professional athletes understand something very important. A sports league cannot exist without its players. The jerseys, the arenas, the television contracts. None of it works if the athletes themselves aren't on the court. That fact has always given players power during labor negotiations. And as rumors about new revenue streams began circulating, some players started discussing whether this moment represented their strongest negotiating position in league history. Not because they wanted conflict, but because they didn't want to miss the opportunity to secure long-term improvements for future generations of athletes. Those conversations reportedly started privately. Quiet discussions among teammates, messages in player group chats, debates about what the future of the league should look like. But according to rumors that began spreading through basketball circles, some of those discussions eventually reached a far more dramatic possibility. What if the players refused to cooperate unless the league addressed their concerns? Not just minor protests. Something bigger. something that would force the entire sports world to pay attention. The word that started appearing in whispers was one that sends chills through any professional league. Strike. Now it's important to understand something clearly. There has never been official confirmation that players were seriously planning to walk out over Caitlin Clark or any single issue. But the rumors themselves reveal how tense the situation had become. Because the conversations weren't really about Clark alone. They were about power, about respect, about the future of the WNBA. Some players reportedly felt that the league was leaning too heavily into a single superstar narrative instead of recognizing the collective talent that had carried the sport for decades. Others worried that the sudden explosion of attention could create long-term inequality if the financial growth wasn't shared fairly across the league. And then there were the cultural tensions. The WNBA has long been one of the most socially active leagues in professional sports. Many players have spoken openly about social issues, community activism, and the importance of representing voices that often go unheard. With millions of new fans entering the sport because of Caitlin Clark, some players began wondering whether the league's identity might shift in ways they couldn't control. These concerns didn't always appear in public statements, but they surfaced in conversations, in interviews, in subtle comments during press conferences. The league office was aware of the tension. Commissioner Kathy Engelbert and league officials began working carefully behind the scenes, attempting to keep the focus on the positive momentum the WNBA was experiencing. Because from a business standpoint, the growth was undeniable. More fans, more money, more attention. This was exactly what the league had been chasing for nearly 30 years. But rapid growth can create pressure. And the faster the WNBA expanded, the more complicated the internal dynamics became. Veteran players wanted recognition for building the league. New fans wanted to celebrate the excitement surrounding Clark. Sponsors wanted to capitalize on the booming popularity. The media wanted headlines. And the league itself was trying to balance all of those forces at the same time. It was a delicate situation, because if players truly believed their voices weren't being heard, they possessed the ultimate leverage. They could simply stop playing. No athletes, no games, no product. And while an actual strike would carry enormous risks for everyone involved, including the players themselves, the very possibility of that kind of conflict was enough to make league officials nervous. Because if the WNBA had finally reached its biggest moment, the last thing anyone wanted was for the season to collapse under the weight of internal tension. For now, the ball continues bouncing. The games continue. Fans continue filling arenas. But the conversations happening behind the scenes could determine what the future of the league looks like. Because the Caitlin Clark era isn't just bringing attention. It's forcing the WNBA to confront questions it has been avoiding for years. Questions about money, about respect, about who truly controls the direction of the sport. And the answers to those questions may shape women's basketball for decades to come. Right now, the WNBA is standing at one of the most important crossroads in its entire history. For nearly 3 decades, the league fought through years of limited coverage, smaller crowds, and constant skepticism about whether women's basketball could ever become a major sports product in the United States. Players sacrificed. They traveled overseas every offseason. They played in half-empty arenas. They continued building the sport, even when very few people were paying attention. And now, suddenly, everything has changed. The arenas are packed. Television networks are competing for broadcast rights. Sponsors are investing millions. And social media conversations about the WNBA are happening every single day. In many ways, this is exactly the breakthrough players had always dreamed about. But breakthroughs come with pressure. Because when a league grows this quickly, the internal balance can shift almost overnight. The Caitlin Clark phenomenon accelerated everything. New fans arrived by the millions. Media coverage exploded. Corporate money started flowing into the sport at a completely different level. And that sudden transformation forced everyone involved with the league to confront a difficult reality. The WNBA isn't the same league it was just a few years ago. It's becoming something much bigger. But with that growth comes the question that every professional league eventually faces. Who gets to shape the future? Is it the league office trying to expand the business? Is it the players who built the foundation of the sport? Is it the new generation of stars bringing massive attention? Or is it the fans whose support ultimately drives the entire industry? Right now, all of those forces are colliding at the same time. Veteran players want recognition for the years they spent carrying the league through its toughest seasons. Younger players want opportunities that match the exploding popularity of the sport. Sponsors want to capitalize on the new attention surrounding stars like Caitlin Clark. And fans are simply enjoying the fact that women's basketball has suddenly become one of the most exciting stories in sports. But balancing those interests isn't easy. Because when money, fame, and attention arrive this quickly, expectations rise just as fast. Players are beginning to push harder for improved salaries and revenue sharing. League officials are trying to manage rapid expansion while protecting long-term stability. Media coverage is amplifying every moment of tension between players and fans. And social media ensures that every controversy spreads instantly across the entire sports world. In other words, the WNBA is experiencing the growing pains of success. The league spent decades fighting to reach this moment. Now that it's finally here, the challenge is figuring out how to handle it. Because if the league navigates this period correctly, the potential is enormous. Women's basketball could become one of the fastest-growing sports industries in the world. Young athletes watching today's games could grow up dreaming of WNBA careers that provide real financial security. Future stars could enter a league that offers opportunities previous generations never had. But if the tension between players, media narratives, and fan expectations continues escalating, the same spotlight that's bringing success could also create division. That's why the next few years may be the most important period the WNBA has ever faced. The decisions being made right now about money, marketing, player treatment, and league identity will shape the sport for decades to come. And in the middle of all of it stands Caitlin Clark, not as the cause of every problem, but as the symbol of a new era that arrived faster than anyone expected. Her popularity didn't create the challenges facing the WNBA. Those issues have existed for years. But her arrival accelerated the timeline. Suddenly the league has to answer questions that once seemed far away. Questions about growth, about fairness, about the balance between business and culture. The truth is, no one knows exactly how this story will unfold. But one thing is absolutely certain. Women's basketball is no longer flying under the radar. The entire sports world is watching. And the next moves made by players, league officials, and the media could determine whether this moment becomes the start of a golden age or the beginning of a new kind of conflict. Because the Caitlin Clark era isn't just changing the WNBA. It's forcing the league to decide exactly what it wants to become. And that decision is still being written in real time. The rise of Caitlin Clark has created one of the most fascinating moments in the history of women's sports. In just a short time, she helped bring millions of new fans into the WNBA. Arenas are packed. Television numbers are climbing. Sponsors are investing like never before. For the first time in decades, women's basketball feels like it's standing on the edge of a massive breakthrough. But with that growth has come tension. Veteran players who spent years building the league are now watching the spotlight shift faster than anyone expected. New fans are arriving with strong opinions and intense loyalty. Media narratives are turning ordinary basketball moments into national debates. And behind the scenes, players and league officials are trying to figure out how to navigate a future that suddenly feels bigger and more complicated than ever before. Because this moment isn't just about Caitlin Clark. It's about the evolution of the entire WNBA. A league that fought for decades to earn respect is now experiencing the kind of attention it once dreamed about. But growth always comes with challenges. And the real question isn't whether the WNBA will continue expanding. It's whether the league can find a way to grow without leaving anyone behind. Because if the players, the fans, and the league itself can find common ground, this could become the most successful era in women's basketball history. But if the tensions continue to rise, the drama we've seen so far might only be the beginning. And the next chapter of this story could be even bigger. If you enjoyed this deep breakdown and want more stories exposing what's really happening behind the scenes in the world of basketball, make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Because the next story we uncover might be even crazier than this one.